Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today for another webinar event in Conn Maciel Carey's 2015 OSHA webinar series. Today we're talking about a very important topic, and that is OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard. And it's particularly important. This is sort of always an important topic in the OSHA circles, but it's particularly important today because we are on the verge of the most significant implementation deadline of the rollout of the new Hazard Communication Standard. And in a time where OSHA rulemaking is lean and limited for various reasons, this is, I think, without a doubt, the most significant rulemaking development during the Obama administration of OSHA. And that is a major change to OSHA's Chemical Right to Know Hazard Communication Standard. That's going to be the topic of today's webinar. This faceless voice that you hear on the phone right now is Eric Conn. I am a founding partner and chair of the National OSHA Practice Group at Conn Maciel Carey, and I will be chiming in from time to time during this webinar. But I'm very pleased to introduce my partner, Kate McMahon, who is going to do the majority of the presentation today. I think she is perhaps the nation's or one of the nation's leading experts in the Hazard Communication Standard, has been involved in the rulemaking process and in the implementation process, and in helping our clients understand what this rule means and how it is going to be enforced by the agency. So I'm pleased to turn the microphone over to Kate and let her give more of a detailed introduction of herself and then dig right into this topic.
Well, thanks, everyone. It's good to be here. It's good to talk to you all over the computer and over the telephone. You know, this is a topic, I guess I say this often in the OSHA area, but this truly is a topic where there's so much to say, and we have so little time here to say it. We have about an hour, and we're going to try to keep crisp on schedule. So I'll move through the material in a relatively steady clip, but I want to let you know, the line is open for questions. We'll try to save some time at the end for questions, and certainly if we don't get to those questions in this webinar, we'd be more than happy to sort of follow up with you directly.
And just along those lines, from the logistics standpoint, to ensure the best audio quality, what we've done is we've muted all of your audio lines, but there is a chat function in the bottom left corner, should be the bottom left corner of your screen. Please feel free during the webinar or at the end of the webinar to type in questions. We'll read them out loud and address as many of them as we can. Also, as a note, we are audio recording this webinar and would be more than happy to make available to you afterwards a link to the recording of the webinar, which includes the audio and the slides, as well as a copy of the slides as well. If there's a possibility you could make good use of them within your organization, we're happy to share them with you. And without further ado, we'll dig into today's topic.
So just very, very briefly, I will give you a little background and introduction on myself. I have developed over the years a bit of an expertise on OSHA rulemakings. So I understand how the agency and have been involved in a lot of the major OSHA rulemakings over the last number of years and decades, in fact. So I understand how the agency develops rules, what are important considerations, how they go from proposal to final, and some of the changes and the issues that we'll talk about today were different in the proposed rule than were in the final HazCom rule. This one is particularly complicated because it derives, of course, from GHS, the UN GHS system that was developed and adopted in 2002. I'm happy to say that I was not involved in OSHA's original development of the HazCom standard. It was promulgated in 1983, so I wasn't around for that, but I have spent a fair amount of time working with the old HazCom and now the new HazCom. So without further ado, let me jump right into the program. What we'd like to talk about today are basically 4 topics within HazCom. I want to spend just a little time talking about the history and purpose of global harmonization so you understand the backdrop for OSHA's 2012 revised Hazard Communication Standard. And then we'll dig right in and talk about the requirements of the new Hazard Communication Standard, how they differ from 1994, from the 1983 standard. We'll, of course, before we get off the phone here today, talk about key implementation deadlines. And some of the deadlines are moving targets. OSHA has developed and issued some recent memoranda on how they will enforce these deadlines in light of concerns raised by stakeholders. And then finally, we'll talk about how the standard is being applied in real-world situations and some best practices. So let me move to talk for just a minute about the original HazCom standard. As many of you probably know, the rule was finalized initially, OSHA's first major hazard communication standard in 1983. That standard applied only to chemical manufacturers and importers. It did not apply broadly to employers who had chemicals in their workplaces. OSHA revised that original standard in the mid-80s, proposed a standard that was much broader, that covered all workplaces that had chemicals where workers were exposed under normal conditions of use or foreseeable emergencies. But that standard was litigated by a number of parties, ultimately resulting in a revision in 1989. And then since then, it's basically been the same standard. So we've had for a couple of decades, until 2012 major revision, the same standard. There were some minor revisions made in 1994, and of course OSHA has issued major interpretations over these decades, interpreting various provisions that were unclear, but based on the regulatory text. One thing I want to point out about the 1983 standard is the preamble has language, and I put it on the slide. I won't read it there, but if you look at it, what you see is even in 1983, OSHA was contemplating an internationally agreed upon standard in the area of hazard communication, and talked about why and how global harmonization of a hazard communication standard would be helpful. So this has been, sort of a long time in the making. The original HazCom standard essentially is and was a very simple standard from the standpoint of how to, the structure of it and how to interpret it. It basically created a 5-element program. And the reason I'm even mentioning this is because new HazCom, revised HazCom, 2012 HazCom, adopts that same 5-element program. The program itself, the standard itself, is structured identically to the old standard. So basically, you have to understand what the old standard was to understand what the new standard is. The old standard, of course, first and foremost, required employers to assess, determine, identify what chemical hazards existed in their workplace. Once those were identified, there were labeling requirements for those hazardous chemicals. There were requirements to develop material safety data sheets, and there were requirements to train workers on the hazards that existed and the precautions to protect against those hazards. That, all of those requirements were wrapped up in what was in a written hazard communication program that was required. So those were the 5 elements. The key point here, and a key difference between, in fact, the difference between original HazCom and the revised 2012 standard, is that the old standard was very performance-oriented. Not a lot of command and control, not a lot of delineation or specification of what had to be on the label. There were requirements about the information that had to be included in the MSDSs, but it did not demand a certain format. So there was a lot of flexibility that chemical manufacturers and importers who were developing labels and MSDSs had in order to comply with the program. Enter United Nations Globally Harmonized System. In a nutshell, I think the language we have on this slide describes and defines what the purpose of GHS is. And it's to develop a systematic worldwide approach for employers to evaluate hazards, and provide employees with consistent information regarding the chemical hazards they may encounter in the workplace. That's the purpose of GHS. The UN, as I think I may have mentioned already, formally adopted GHS in 2002. And if you look at GHS itself and the Purple Book, which defines and describes GHS, you'll see that it's not a model standard. You can't just take that standard, that language, and plop it into a regulation. It's essentially concepts and certain provisions that the GHS coordinating committee that drafted the program wanted countries to adopt and be able to build into their existing regulatory structure. So essentially, GHS is a set of building blocks for countries to use in their own regulations. One of the key things to understand about GHS and to understand about what this means for 2012 revised HazCom is that GHS is a living document. When OSHA adopted revised HazCom in 2012 and adopted the GHS standard into it, they were looking at Rev 3 of GHS. Next year, we expect that the UN will issue Rev 6. So in the few years since OSHA adopted the revised standard, there have been a couple of additional revisions made to GHS. It's a living document, and it will continue that way for the foreseeable future. There will be ever-changing developments in technology and understanding of hazards and in the science, and those developments are intended to be reflected in revisions to GHS. What that means is that OSHA will continue to, presumably, and OSHA states it will continue to revise the Hazard Communication Standard to be consistent with GHS. And there are a lot of questions about how OSHA is going to do that. They say they'll go through notice and comment rulemaking for any significant changes. They also indicate they may use direct final rules, which is a tool and tactic OSHA rarely relies on, but has available to it under certain circumstances. So they make it's a much quicker process, but there's less ability for stakeholders to comment. And so, the question is out there as to how OSHA will continually revise hazard communication. The UN encouraged all countries to implement GHS into their own systems by 2008. So I don't know that I need to go through this slide, which talks about the goals and benefits of GHS, but I guess if you were to broad brush create a couple of different categories of benefits that the United Nations, the Coordinating Committee, and OSHA were to identify for GHS, the primary benefits, it certainly would be to, enable a better understanding of the hazards that employees are exposed to in the workplace. And there's I have 5 or 6 bullets on there that basically say the same thing, that both supervisory personnel responsible for safety, responsible for operations at a facility, as well as employees themselves will have a better understanding of what the hazards are at their facility and a better understanding of what precautions can be used to protect against those hazards. That, as I said at the outset, is one of the main goals of GHS. The last bullet that is included on the slide is something not to be lost in the shuffle here. An additional major goal and objective of GHS was to lessen trade barriers that existed or were created by the existence of different chemical hazard communication requirements in across the world in various countries. So where companies in the U.S., for instance, were creating products that had chemicals, that non-article products that would be regulated by HazCom, they would be required to develop different labels depending on where they were sending their product. And that obviously created a lot of cost and created barriers for trade. So this was an identified benefit, the easing of international trade for U.S. companies. Okay, so OSHA adopted GHS. As I mentioned, the GHS was formally adopted in December 2002. Recommendation from the UN to have all countries adopt it by 2008. In 2006, OSHA issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. The proposed rule itself came out in 2009, and they finalized the rule in 2012. And as I said, that was based on GHS Rev 3. We're now facing next year probably Rev 6. One of the important points that I want to point out here, I guess, is unlike a lot of major OSHA rulemakings, the comments received from stakeholders across the board, both industry groups as well as labor, were overwhelmingly supportive of the adoption of GHS into the hazard. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone supported all aspects of the proposed rule. They certainly did not. Industry raised major concerns. But if you look at the docket, you'll see that overall there really was a huge amount of support for this general type of revision to incorporate global harmonization into OSHA's hazard communication. Okay, so 2012 we get revised HazCom. What do we see? We see essentially the same 5-element program as we had in 1983 and 1989 original HazCom. The big difference, as I said, is the standard shifted from a performance-based standard to a highly detailed specification standard. The specifications relate specifically to how you assess, evaluate, determine what a hazard is or whether a chemical poses a hazard. That's now referred to as the classification of a hazard and the categorization of a hazard. But it is essentially what you did under old HazCom. You determined whether a chemical posed a hazard, and if so, what that hazard was, and what the precautionary measures were that needed to be taken to protect employees from it. That specification is all laid out in mandatory appendices that are attached to the revised standard. The other major changes that are included in the revised HazCom standard are very specific mandates and directives for the content and language that is to be included on the labels and on the now SDSs rather than the MSDSs. I assume that most of you on this phone call have a general familiarity with, the basic approach to HazCom and worked probably a lot with the old HazCom, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. Just wanted to, at this point, give you an overview of what old HazCom was, what GHS did, and what new HazCom does. We have a slide up here which attributes the statement to Dr. Michaels. OSHA's 1983 Hazard Communication Standard gave workers the right to know. This update will give them the right to understand. I happen to know from good sources that that statement actually was from the United Steelworkers, who made it in a comment to OSHA during the rulemaking, but OSHA liked it and they adopted it as their own. So that's the point, that the new standard is supposed to make it easier for workers and employers to understand the risks as opposed to sort of list the risks, the hazardous risks associated with the chemicals at their workplace. Just a moment on costs and benefits. These are OSHA's numbers. OSHA's numbers sometimes, often, we wonder about, but Their calculation anyway is that the total annualized cost to comply with revised HazCom is about $201 million. That mainly is associated with the categories that we list on this slide, which is to actually undergo this new hazard classification and categorization for each of the hazardous chemicals at your workplace, and then to make the attendant revisions to the SDSs and the labels, printing costs of new labels, et cetera, and some costs associated with new training. The benefits, though, to the new standard, OSHA has identified that there'll be, 43 saved lives and 203 lost workday injuries and illnesses that will be avoided. If you monetize those benefits, you see a reduction in risk at $250 million and a huge reduction in productivity. A huge savings in productivity improvement. A lot of industry commenters questioned that productivity value. OSHA's view is that this new process will streamline the hazard identification and assessment systems at individual employers' facilities and save time and therefore allow for productivity increases. OSHA also identifies the savings associated with revising the labels. They think that using these, and I think there's some merit to this, using these formats that will exist, these directives about what you put on a label and the specific formats of the SDSs will make it easier to revise those as new information comes in. All told, OSHA believes that this rule will result in a huge cost savings to employers, $556 million as monetized benefits. Okay, so now I think we get into the real meat of this webinar, which is to talk about the actual requirements of the new standard. As I mentioned earlier, if you look at the new standard, it looks very similar to the old standard. The regulatory text follows identically the old standard. So if you look at, for instance, Section E of 1983 or 1989, 1994 HazCom and 2012 HazCom, that's the section that deals with the written hazard communication program requirements. Section F is labels. Section G is SDSs. The big difference is, even though the old standard also had appendices, the new mandatory appendices that you find following the actual regulatory text are the heart, core, and center of this new standard. Those appendices, all of them, but in particular Appendix A and Appendix B, explain, direct, and mandate how you are to conduct your hazard determination, which, as I said, is now called a hazard classification and then a hazard categorization. Two separate activities that a chemical manufacturer and importer undergoes to develop its understanding of what the hazards are, which then get reflected in the safety data sheets and in the labels. All right, so a point I want to make, bullet number 2, or want to at least remind you about, that the Hazard Communication Standard has always been and continues to be a standard where OSHA intends to have the inherent hazards of a chemical assessed, evaluated, identified, and communicated, right? So what is not there's a tension here that I want to describe, but what OSHA says is that this is not a standard to evaluate risk. Risk factors in the likelihood of an employee being exposed. This standard, rather, is supposed to identify inherent hazards of a chemical, whether or not they will be realized in the workplace. Now there's a lot. If you look at the preambles to both the 1983 as well as this rule, OSHA talks about this concept of assessing inherent hazards as opposed to identifying realized risks to employees. But I note for you that the scope and application section of revised HazCom as well as original HazCom, section B2 of the standard, does provide a limit to that assessment of inherent hazards. Section B2 limits the scope of the standard to cover any chemical which is known to be present in such a manner that employees may be exposed under normal conditions of use or foreseeable emergencies. So that concept of identifying chemicals where there is a risk associated with, or there may be a hazard present associated with the normal conditions of use or foreseeable emergencies, I believe does factor in to some extent the realization of risk. And so this is a tension that was identified, raised in a lot of different contexts under old HazCom, and OSHA has not clarified it under new HazCom. So we live with that tension. So yeah, I guess that's basically the point that I want to make here on the new purpose and scope sections of the rule. The hazard classification section, or section, I think it's section D of the rule. As I mentioned, specific criteria are included in Appendix A and Appendix B to direct a chemical manufacturer and an employer as to how to assess or classify the health and physical hazards associated with the particular chemical. The hazard classification, which basically is to identify the nature of the hazard, the type of hazard we're talking about, whether it's carcinogenicity, flammability, acute toxicity, the type of hazard. The hazard categorization is to capture the degree of severity that is posed from that chemical. And the degrees are, associated. Each hazard class is given a separate set of severity degrees, if you will. So for instance, and almost all, but not all, of the hazard classes have various levels of severity associated with them in the appendices. The appendices, by the way, have to become your Bible if you are making hazard classifications. And you'll see, just as an example, we put up here for flammability, there are 4 levels of severity, going from level 1, which is the most severe, to level 4, which is the least severe. Same with acute toxicity. You'll see the various levels of severity. They're captured in the class. Another point that I think is important to understand is, unlike the old rule, where, for shorthand we say there was a one-study rule, the one-study rule was, if there was one study that identified a hazard associated with a particular chemical, that was sufficient to determine that a chemical was hazardous. That's it, end of study, end of story, you're in HazCom. And then you had great flexibility as to how you describe that hazard and the precautions to protect against it. Here, it's somewhat different. The language of the appendices talks about making hazard classification determinations based on weight of evidence, evaluated using expert judgment. And there's been a lot of question that's been raised by chemical manufacturers and importers making these determinations as to, what that means and how much discretion is given by those requirements or by that language. Yes, my interpretation of that language is that there is some discretion that is given to the chemical manufacturer making these determinations by pulling together, because it allows the chemical manufacturer to essentially pull together its team of experts and consider all of the evidence that exists and make determinations based on the weight of evidence, giving discretion to weigh good studies over bad studies, and doing a holistic approach to a classification, a hazard classification. One additional point I want to, kind of raise here is it looks to me as if a chemical manufacturer can override a study if the weight of evidence suggests that it is, that study does not drive how the hazard should be classified. And I think that is true even where certain of the hazard classifications have threshold criteria, cutoff criteria in the standard itself, in the mandatory appendices. So where you have cutoff criteria and a study exists, for instance, an animal study exists that falls within that threshold, it may be that there's enough evidence out there that is contradictory with that one, for instance, animal study, that the weight of the evidence analyzed, and with expert judgment brought to bear on the full range of evidence, suggests that study, that even if it shows you fall within a certain threshold for a severity categorization, does not carry the day. I think there may be some litigation over that, and there certainly will be a lot of interpretations written by OSHA in this area. So this next slide essentially just puts up, for your ease of reference really, the various health hazards that have been identified by OSHA. OSHA, the structure of the standard separates health hazards from physical hazards. So these are the health hazards, and the numbers on the right-hand side identify the various levels of or categories that exist associated with those health hazards. So for instance, the top one, acute toxicity, there are four, as I think I mentioned, four severity categories, one being the most severe, four being the least severe. This next slide just lists the physical hazards, and there's a similar categorization that exists for this. I just didn't put it on this slide, but it's a very similar concept where there are ranges of categories that measure the severity of a hazard. A word about mixtures, and I am really, rushing through this because we could spend a full hour just on mixtures. We could spend a full hour on physical or health hazard category classifications, but I want to at least give an overview. And again, Eric and I certainly are available to help answer, any questions you might have. I think we have a pretty good handle on this, and we've been involved in numerous interpretations that OSHA is considering, and so, there's some drill down that we could do, and I'll try to do maybe a little bit of that at the end. Okay, so, when you step back and think about it, most chemicals in most workplaces exist in mixture form. They're not pure chemicals. Obviously that's not true 100%, but many employers deal with mixtures, right? So how do you classify, how do you categorize mixtures? The revised standard, and this is a change from the old standard. I think there's still a question as to how different it's going to be, but the revised standard essentially creates this tiered approach to mixture classification determinations. First, what you do is, if there is test data on the mixture itself, that is the data you use. That's the gold standard. That's what you're supposed to, under this standard, what you're required, in fact, to use to make a determination as to the classification and categorization of that mixture. However, a lot of times there is not data that exists, test data on the mixture itself. So what does a blender do, for instance? And the step 2 and step 3 are the concepts that exist in the rule that describe what you're supposed to do in order to determine the hazard of a mixture. There are these bridging principles that are used. For instance, how do you factor in dilution? These bridging principles that are laid out in the appendices are supposed to be followed to make determinations about classifications for mixtures. And then finally, there are cutoff values that are in the standard itself, in the appendices, that are based on composition of the mixture, and those are supposed to be followed. So there's this step-by-step approach that you take to this mixture evaluation. A couple of things to note. Just like the old standard, you don't have to conduct any tests. There's no requirement under the standard to actually conduct testing on your chemicals. You're allowed to rely on what exists already. And a chemical blender is allowed to rely on the upstream SDSs that you get, as long as you don't know or have with reasonable diligence, or should know with reasonable diligence, that it omits information or it's inaccurate or mistaken, inappropriately or inaccurately reflects the hazards. If that's not the case, you're allowed to rely on whatever the SDS of the ingredient chemicals tell you. For health hazards, the assumption is that the mixture presents the same hazards as any and all of the component parts that comprise 1%, by weight or volume, of the mixture, or if it's a carcinogen, 0.1%. So that concept is lifted out of the old HazCom and brought into new HazCom. That's for health hazards. And for physical hazards, you're allowed to use whatever scientifically valid information and data is available to you, including, as I said, the information on upstream SDSs. Okay, so here's just a sort of a visual depiction from OSHA's Quick Card about the SDSs. The SDS, how's it different? How's it the same? This is a good visual, and the next slide shows you the same information in a different format. The big difference between the old standard, which required the creation of material safety data sheets, MSDSs, and the new standard, which requires the creation of safety data sheets, SDSs, is that you have to follow this prescribed format that's listed on these two slides. Section 1 through Section 16, no deviation. You've got to fill in these categories, one point to note is categories 12 through 15 are categories over which OSHA does not really have jurisdiction. These are DOT, EPA information topics. So ecological data, EPA has jurisdiction over. Same with disposal. Transport is information that DOT has control over. So OSHA does not and is not going to, and has said they will not enforce the content. You've got to keep those boxes there. You've got to keep that format the same, but you can leave that blank. You don't even have to fill it in, those 12 through 15 categories.
One addition here, the point being that the burden certainly falls on the chemical manufacturer to develop this SDS and to comply with the SDS format in the new standard, but as a downstream employer, an employer who has chemicals in the workplace, you've had this obligation under the old rule to keep a copy of the MSDS in your facility. You need to do that, obviously, under the new rule, the same obligation to have SDSs available for the chemicals that are present in your workplace, and it's your burden to make sure that you have a version, you have a copy that complies with the new requirement. So you don't have to develop that, but there is going to be some effort to sort of clean out your old MSDSs, update them with the newer format, and that may require, in some instances, communications with your suppliers, communications with the manufacturers to make sure that you have current versions that meet the new standard. And that's the big deadline that is coming up is for manufacturers to get these SDSs up to date and into the current format. That same obligation will fall to downstream users to make sure that their SDS collections are current and accurate and meeting the new required format.
So just a couple of points that we wanted to raise. One, people can disagree about this, but I don't think that there's that much change in the content as opposed to the format on the SDS front. I don't feel exactly the same on the labeling front, but on the SDS front format, it's basically the same. And mandatory Appendix D is where you go. That's your Bible for the creation of the SDS. Note that that one of the reasons I think it's not that different is ANSI Z40.1 already. This was the standard format for the ANSI Z40 standard, and that was in I think pretty widespread use well before 2012. So those entities that had already switched over to the ANSI format or had followed the ANSI format would be already compliant with the SDS requirement of the new revised standard. Remember, TLVs have to be listed on the SDS. The IARC and NTP information about cancer, carcinogenicity information has to be included on the SDSs. Important point and, concerning point, I think.
Yeah, we've highlighted this one in orange because the significance here is that most of the TLVs and most of the other consensus standards or things that are allowed to change as you understand chemistry and technology better and change promptly are often more stringent than OSHA's PELs. And so the idea of posting on your SDS a TLV value, which is probably lower than the OSHA regulatory level, lower than the PEL, has already caused some interesting issues for some industries where exposures have been cited by OSHA under the general duty clause where the exposure level did not exceed the PEL, but it did exceed, a TLV or some other industry consensus standard. And OSHA is out there enforcing that little by little. We are keeping an eye on that to see if that's going to become a major strategy. But the idea, of course, the general duty clause allows OSHA to enforce recognized serious hazards. And being able to point to something like a TLV to say it's a recognized hazard because this consensus standard has set an exposure level here. You recognized it, employer, because it's on your SDS, either an SDS you created or one that's in your binder. And here it is right there in front of you. How can you say you didn't recognize this hazard? So this creates an opportunity for OSHA to enforce in an area where I think there's a real tension, enforcing at a level that is below the threshold requirement that OSHA has set, but above some threshold requirement that some other non-mandatory organization has set, and using the general duty clause to do that. So that's why we highlight that point here.
And, we'll spend no more than 20 seconds, but the real place where this is, I think there are major concerns being raised is OSHA's decision to annotate the Table Z of, 1910-1000. Table Z now includes the TLVs in the annotated version, and there's been real question about what that means in terms of OSHA's ability to use the general duty force. So one more point on this, but that's an entirely separate webinar. So one more point on this slide, the last bullet that we included here. Note that after everything goes into effect, after this June, basically, if a chemical manufacturer gathers new health information, health hazard information, for instance, and that would result in a change of classification or supplemental information that ought to be included on the SDS, the chemical manufacturer will be given 3 months from the receipt of the date of the new information, from learning of that new information to revise the SDS. After that point, after that 3-month point, the next shipment of that chemical will need to have the new SDS. Okay, the new labels, really different from the old labels. All kinds of new, requirements, good or bad or indifferent. I won't comment. It's just a really different label than you would have seen under old HazCom, or could have seen anyway under old HazCom. Now, I will say that a lot of entities were following something pretty similar, including pretty similar information on the labels, but it certainly wasn't required. So the new labels, what do they look like? They have the following 6 a new label will have the following 6 requirements, and sort of starting on the right side of the page from the bottom and working backwards. Supplier information, that's the responsible party information. That's basically, the name, the address, and the phone number of the supplier of the chemical. The product identifier, that's easy, and that was on all the old ones. What is this? Chlorine, bleach, whatever. Now, the new stuff, the precautionary statements, the hazard statement, the pictogram, and the common signal word. Let me just spend a minute or two on these, okay? So now we'll back up and start from the beginning. Common signal word. That is it's either danger or warning, basically. It's a word that is intended to indicate the relative level of severity of the hazard. Danger being a worse hazard, a more severe hazard, warning being a less severe hazard. Let me back up and say that the OSHA describes the labeling process as sort of a cookbook process. I think it's more of a plotting exercise. What you do is you go to the appendices, Appendix C of HazCom, and you basically plot your hazard. You figure out, okay, if you have an acutely toxic hazard and it's Category 2, you look that page up basically, and it will lay out for you pretty much exactly what you've got to have on your new label. So there's not a lot of discretion. It'll tell you what the signal word would be for, Category 2 acutely toxic chemical. I happen to know the word is danger. And the pictogram, okay, so that's the common signal word. The pictogram, I think there's been a lot of talk about this. The next, if we fast forward to a slide a couple later, here's an example of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 pictograms that OSHA will require. The pictogram has to be in this red triangular border. That's a requirement. Every red triangular border has to have a picture in it. None can be blank. I'm not sure why OSHA, what a blank one would be, but you can't have a blank one. The pictograms are intended to, in an instant, provide a visual alert to the employee who is, dealing with this chemical as to what its hazard is. My only real comment on the pictograms here is that I'm not sure they're quite as intuitively obvious as, maybe OSHA thinks. I mean, that health hazard pictogram, if you're looking at the screen, it's in the bottom left. It's the, shadow of the human with the, star thing coming out of it, the center of its chest. I mean, I don't know, looks to me like some sort of religious symbol or something. I'm not sure I would have picked up that obviously means this chemical has a health hazard. But, these are obviously pictograms that OSHA adopted from various places. So anyway, back to, the label and its content. The hazard statement, would you go back one? The hazard statement, that is a brief, succinct description, new labels, brief, succinct description of the nature of the hazard. So, for instance, fatal if swallowed is a hazard statement that is associated with Category 1 and Category 2 acutely toxic chemicals. Category 3 and 4 acutely toxic chemicals, for instance, have the hazard statement, harmful if swallowed. All right, so it's a very brief statement that indicates the nature of the hazard. And then finally, the precautionary statement. The precautionary statement is the most lengthy word-wise requirement for the new label. And if you look at the precautionary statements that OSHA's appendices that describe the precautionary statement, you will see that there is some language that's included in bold. Any language included in bold in the appendices is mandated. It's required language on the label. The language that's not in bold is basically a directive to the chemical manufacturer as to what, it's like a fill in the blank. The chemical manufacturer has to fill in whatever that non-bolded language tells you to include. And then there is some italicized language that's included in Appendix C under the precautionary statement language. That is actually not required to be. In fact, I don't believe it can be in the precautionary statement. It's to give additional information to the manufacturer to help categorize, derive the label, but it is not required, nor can it be on the label itself. Okay, so just a couple of key points. All right, Appendix C, I told you. As I said with SDSs, with labels, once the rule goes into effect in June 1st, 2015, chemical manufacturer will have 6 months from the date it learns of new information to change the label. So shipments that go out after the 6-month point will need to have the new label on it. Workplace labels, that's a concept that was in the old HazCom, the original HazCom standard, and it's in the new HazCom standard. It is under F6 of the old standard, of the revised standard. And basically what it says is for workplace labels, those are labels on containers that exist in the workplace that are not being shipped out of the workplace. So work, containers. Those can, to comply with the alternative workplace requirement, you can just comply with the shipping container label and you satisfy the workplace labels, or you can include the product identifier and any combination of words, pictures, or symbols that conveys at least some general understanding to the worker of the hazard that is associated with that chemical. And when you read that, combination of words, pictures, and symbols in conjunction with other information that's required by the Hazard Communication Standard, you have to be able to have an immediate understanding of the specific health and physical hazards associated with that chemical. So it was intended as a sort of a breather for companies to not have to use the pictograms and the precautionary statements and that sort of thing on their workplace containers where the workers were already trained in HazCom and had other mechanisms to understand what the hazards they were facing would be. All right, so moving ahead to hazards not otherwise classified. Okay, just a word about that because we're really running low on time. Okay, hazards not otherwise classified, HNOCs. A lot of questions about these. Basically, HNOCs are hazards that hazards of a chemical that would have, for instance, been in the original HazCom, would have been picked up in the original HazCom, but are not included in GHS classifications. So if you look at the GHS classifications of health and physical hazards and you see those lists that I included on that slide earlier, these are hazards that don't fit into any of those categories or classes, but yet are still hazards. Under the proposed standard for this rulemaking, asphyxiants and pyrophoric gases and I think combustible dust were all sort of fit in that category. They weren't listed under GHS, but they were identified hazards, and they were called, under the proposed rule, unclassified hazards. The final rule does not use that language, unclassified hazards. It creates HNOCs, and for HNOCs, note that you do have to include the hazard identification information in Section 2 of the SDS for that chemical, but you do not have to include the hazard information on the label of an HNOC chemical. I'm sorry I'm moving so fast, but I got to get through this. Note also that the asphyxiants and the pyrophoric gases are now actually explicitly covered in revised HazCom in the final standard, unlike the proposal. So you do have to have SDSs and labels for those chemicals. Those are specifically and explicitly defined. Combustible dust, there's still no definition. OSHA's obviously got great difficulty coming up with a comprehensive and good definition for combustible dust, hence one of the reasons for the delay in the combustible dust rulemaking. But there's no definition that you find in HazCom either, but they do provide guidance, and the standard says that you have to have SDSs and labeling for combustible dust hazards. Now, OSHA's issued a fair amount of clarification on that in their interpretation letter. So if you're dealing with a chemical that may cause a combustible dust in certain form, you should definitely look at those interpretations. Okay, finally, compliance deadlines. I think probably most of you are dealing with HazCom and trying to come up to speed are familiar with these deadlines. We had the first deadline was way back in December of 2013. That was where you had to do your initial training on the new label elements, the pictograms, the precautionary statements, hazard statements, etc., and on the new SDS format. That's come and gone. June 2015, just a couple of months from now, that's the big deadline. You've got to comply with all aspects of the new standard, except for a couple of things, which we'll mention. But basically, you have to be in full compliance, except those workplace labels that I talked about. OSHA's giving leeway on that. You don't have to have your workplace labels in place until a full year from this June 2016, all right? You also don't have to have your written hazard communication program in place until June 2016, and basically those are kind of the two biggies. And finally, for distributors, you see the December 1st, 2015 deadline. OSHA's giving an additional 6 months to allow for inventory drawdown for distributors who are shipping chemicals with the old HazCom labels. Big, development here. One final extension. OSHA just recently, I think in June, issued an extension. Well, it's not an actual extension, but they are saying in writing that they're going to use their enforcement discretion to not enforce against manufacturers, importers, formulators who make good efforts, use the exercise of reasonable diligence and make good faith efforts, but are unable to develop a hazard classification, and therefore the SDS and the attendant label, because they don't have appropriate or sufficient information to classify their chemical. Those manufacturers will be given leeway, and OSHA says they will, and OSHA is not going to enforce against them. Okay, so we're essentially out of time here. Eric, do you want to, just give some concluding remarks?
Yeah, well, I think we'll just cover a couple of points on this last slide. That, the most important one to me, Kate, has great experience in rulemaking. My background is primarily on enforcement, so I did want to make one observation here that whenever in the past OSHA has done something like this, implemented a major rule or implemented a major change to an existing rule, they undertake a lot of effort to educate industry about the rule. And they've done that, I think, pretty substantially in this rule. They've done that by YouTube videos and fact sheets and also, and talking at trade association conferences and putting out lots and lots of information about the new rule. They have announced that they are putting out a compliance directive, which is a tool for their compliance staff, but also a great tool for employers and others to understand exactly how OSHA intends to implement the rule. That's one other element of educating industry. Another is through guidance documents like what we see on their website, lots of interpretation letters. We've been actively involved in getting interpretation letters written to clarify positions that impact our clients. But the last thing that OSHA does, frankly, to educate industry about a new rule is to enforce the heck out of it. And historically, the Hazard Communication Standard has always been among the top 3 or 4 most frequently cited standards. Well, you better believe that starting on June 1st of this year, it is going to meet that standard and then some, because that's a way for OSHA to educate. You've seen these big press releases, the regulation by shaming. If OSHA can cobble together a meaningful enough enforcement action, they put out a press release about it, broadcast it to the country that, hey, we're serious about this, and if you haven't paid attention to this new rule, you better pay attention, or this is going to happen to you. So I would really, try to avoid being that poster child. Prepare now. If you haven't started the process already, you may be behind the 8 ball, but it's not too late to get, to get your program in order. But you really don't want to be the one on January 2nd who OSHA comes in to visit on an employee complaint or an incident and has problems with your HazCom program, because OSHA is going to make sure that the country knows about the new rule by putting out press releases about the poster child enforcement actions that they've brought. So now's the time to really dig in and make sure you've got your bases covered in this regard. So I think with that, we'll wrap things up for today's webinar. I encourage you all to join us for other webinars. We do one just about every month or so as part of our 2015 webinar series. We have some great ones coming up regarding OSHA inspections, regarding our aging workforce in this country, and other important issues on the horizon from the OSHA enforcement standpoint. Also would encourage you all to look out for an announcement coming soon, I've been saying this for a little while, of the launch of our new blog. The OSHA Defense Report will be live and active soon, and if you're on this webinar, very good chance you'll be getting an email from me about that when that happens. We have sort of run out of time. I've addressed a couple of questions that came in by email. I've addressed those directly in the chat room. But if you have questions about this, please don't hesitate to contact Kate or me. You could tell Kate is enthusiastic about this. I characterize myself as an OSHA nerd. I love talking about these sort of things and would be glad to visit with you about any issues you have with Hazard Communication Standard or any other OSHA issues. And we look forward to you joining us for other webinars or other events in the future. And thanks for joining us today. Have a great day.